All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 62 for May 2024. 3 more Philadelphia magazines: Graham's, Peterson's, Lippincott's. Laurel Hill East is a National Historic Landmark, an arboretum, a sculpture garden, a nature preserve, and an active cemetery in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It opened in 1836. It remains a popular visiting spot for tens of thousands of visitors every year. Its sister cemetery, Laurel Hill West, located across the Schuylkill River in Bala Cynwyd, was founded in 1869. It has a history and a population of its own. I am Dr. Joe Lex, retired professor of emergency medicine from Temple University in Philadelphia, volunteer tour guide at Laurel Hill East and Laurel Hill West, and volunteer podcaster. The best magazine of the 19th century is generally acknowledged as Graham's magazine, even though it lasted only a few years. Founder and editor George Rex Graham went through many ups and downs in publishing this gem. Charles Peterson was a friend of Graham's who struck out on his own and published Peterson's magazine. His son would have taken over the business, but for an incident down the shore that led to his disappearance. Other Peterson family members worked for Saturday Evening Post, Godey's Ladies' Book, and other magazines. And Joshua B. Lippincott was comparatively late to the magazine business, but his magazine featured some of the best works of Rudyard Kipling, Oscar Wilde, Oscar Conan Doyle, and others. Graham, Peterson, and Lippincott are interred at Laurel Hill East. I did not have time to research D. Herbert Lipson, longtime editor of Philadelphia magazine, who's interred at Laurel Hill West. I will have to cover him in another episode. These 3 men were born within a few years of each other, and they were all good friends in life. They are featured in this month's episode of All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 62 for May 2024. 3 more Philadelphia magazines: Graham's, Peterson's, and Lippincott's. I have talked about magazines and their connections to Laurel Hill in past episodes. In All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 30, I talked about Joseph Clay Neal and the Saturday Courier, Louis Antoine Godey and Godey's Ladies' Book, Morton McMichael. All 3 are interred at Laurel Hill East. In All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 16, I talked about the Curtis Publishing Company with its successful Saturday Evening Post and Ladies' Home Journal. Post publisher Cyrus Curtis is at Laurel Hill West, while his editor, George Horace Lorimer, is at East, as well as his first wife, Louisa Knapp Curtis, who edited the Journal. The first magazine of literary value in the United States, and now acknowledged as one of the best of the 19th century, was Graham's magazine, which only had a run from 1841 to 1858, but it's considered the best of its day for many reasons. The life of George Rex Graham covered all but 18 years of the 19th century. He was born in Philadelphia on 18 January 1813, just a few weeks before the threat of British invasion forced the formation of a citizens' committee for defense of the city. His mother was from the old and prosperous Rex family of Montgomery County. His father was a, quote, gentleman of education and fortune, end quote, who had made a prosperous living in shipping. George, his sister Mary, and brother William were orphaned before they reached their teen years and were taken in by George's namesake. George attended a country school and then took a job tending a country store for a year. In 1832, at age 19, George Graham returned to Philadelphia and apprenticed himself to a cabinet maker. This allowed him to undertake legal training, which is what his father had wanted. His trade required him to work 10 to 12 hours a day, but Graham rigidly devoted himself to an additional 6 hours of study daily, often rising before dawn. It was about this time that Graham met Charles J. Peterson, who would become a lifelong friend, and Joseph R. Chandler, another literary lawyer. The three men found time to hang around together at Bamford's Tavern, where they sipped wine and read to each other. It was in 1839 that things came together for Graham. In January, he was appointed editor of Samuel Coates Atkinson's Evening Post and Philadelphia Saturday News. In March, the Philadelphia Bar admitted Graham to practice. In April, he married Elizabeth P. Fry, and he became half owner of Atkinson's cheap reprint monthly, The Casket. It was a knockoff of Godey's that used engraved fashion plates from American and English annals and other periodicals. There were also many unimpressive woodcuts of flowers and American scenery. In November, he bought a half interest in the weekly newspaper of which he was editor. So it must have also been in 1839 that the 26-year-old Graham fixed his ambitions on being a magazine editor. In March 1840, the firm that bore his name assumed full control of the Saturday Evening Post, and in October he purchased Burton's Gentleman's Magazine, which a young man from Richmond, Virginia, named Edgar Allan Poe had been editing for several months. By October, Graham had formed his plan for a popular monthly magazine, and in January 1841 appeared the first issue of Graham's magazine. He merged the subscription lists of both The Casket and Gentleman's Magazine to supply his new publication, whose full name was Graham's Ladies and Gentlemen's Magazine, The Casket and Gentlemen's United, embracing every department of literature, embellished with engravings, fashions in music, arranged for the pianoforte, harp, and guitar. Graham now had control of a promising new monthly periodical and an established weekly newspaper. It is still uncertain where this impecunious orphan got the money to buy a magazine, possibly from his uncle, possibly from his new wife's family. Graham's magazine began with volume 18, since it was the addition of the 10 volumes of Atkinson's Casket and 7 volumes of Burton's Gentleman's Magazine. Both the Post and Graham's were published from a building on the southwest corner of 3rd and Chestnut Streets in the publishing district of the city. Graham's office was on the top floor of the new Public Ledger building. It also contained the offices of that newspaper, of the Dollar newspaper, and of the publisher G.B. Zeber. Just down the street at number 101 were the offices of Godey's Ladies' Book and the Philadelphia Saturday Museum. Magazine historian Frank Luther Mott has estimated that between 1825 and 1850, the number of periodicals in the country, other than newspapers, rose from fewer than 100 to about 600. Graham's magazine was an instantaneous success. Its circulation rose from 5,000 to 25,000 just in the first year. And by the end of the second year, circulation had grown to about 50,000. Graham's formula for success was simple. Adopt the features that have been popular in other magazines, like illustrations, fashion plates, and book reviews, plus enough sentimental poetry and fiction to satisfy women readers. Plus, Graham's was one of the first American magazines to use almost exclusively the writings of American authors, rather than pirate material from European and other American journals. It took Graham about a year to get his set of regular authors together. Initially, he had material from James Russell Lowe, who was sometimes writing under the name of H. Percival, and material from his co-editor, Poe. By January 1842, he had gathered contributions from Longfellow, Lowell, Poe, George Pope Morris, Park Benjamin, William Gilmore Simms, Henry William Herbert, and several popular women writers, including Lydia Sigourney, Emma C. Embry, Anne S. Stevens, and Amelia B. Welby. By the end of that year, he'd added the names of William Cullen Bryant and James Fenimore Cooper. Soon he secured contributions from Nathaniel Hawthorne, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Richard Henry Dana, and Henry David Thoreau, but he could not persuade them to become regulars. The only major American writers that Graham failed to capture were Washington Irving, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Walt Whitman, and Herman Melville. Irving naturally leaned toward the Knickerbocker. Emerson was just too aloof and uninterested. Through Horace Greeley and Rufus Griswold, Graham offered Emerson $50 to print one of his lectures. It was an excellent price, but the answer from Concord stated, "I fancied my work worth twice so much as the sum stated." A typical number of Graham's during the 1840s contained 3 or 4 short stories, a light essay on manners, a biographical sketch, a literary article, a considerable amount of poetry, narrative, lyrical, and didactic, an outdoor sketch by Frank Forrester, which was a pen name for Henry William Herbert. There'd be a travel article, fine arts and book review departments, and a chat with the editor, besides the colored fashion plate and 1 or 2 art plates by well-known engravers. Short stories were not Graham's strongest feature, but co-editor Poe did much to bring up the quality. Serial stories, such as those published by Dickens and Conan Doyle, did not come into magazines until later. Graham ran the magazine with a high level of ethical standards. He insisted that contributions be original. He set a high rate of payment for established authors, and in some cases paid more than the author asked or expected. Once he established a rate for an author, he never went below that figure. Unlike his competitor Godey, he refused to advertise as a regular contributor any writer who was not just that. After Godey asked his authors for citywide exclusivity, Graham was forced to do the same. Graham also topped Godey when he snagged the services of the best engraver in town, John Sartain. Graham had decided from the beginning of his time in charge to use only fresh engraved plates for each edition, rather than reusing steel or copper plates from earlier pressings. More engravers were added until a stable of artists provided beautiful, precise, unique pictures for every issue. Still, another problem was competition from magazines which paid nothing for the English articles which they pirated. In this regard, Harper's Magazine, founded in 1850, was the chief offender. Graham stuck to his ethics, and he printed only new American writings. For literary discrimination, Graham depended on his co-editors. His friend and associate on the Post, Charles J. Peterson, was faithful and capable help until he started his own Peterson's Magazine in 1842. More about that shortly. 32-year-old Edgar Allan Poe, who had been associated with Burton for 1 year in the editorship of the Gentleman's, became a member of the Graham editorial staff in 1841. Biographers of Poe often incorrectly state that he was the editor-in-chief of the magazine. No, he was the literary editor. And for $800 a year, he was expected to provide the book notices and for extra pay a certain amount of the literary content. Some of Poe's best writing was done for Graham's during the 15 months of his connection to it. His opening contribution was an article called The Murders in the Rue Trianon-Bas in the original manuscript, but revised to the more suggestive Rue Morgue, which appeared in April 1841. A Descent into the Maelstrom came out the next month. To Helen appeared in small type at the bottom of a page in September of that year, and The Mask of the Red Death in May 1842. Indeed, there were contributions by Poe in every number from April 1841 to June 1842. His criticism was characteristically ungenerous, but acute and meticulous. His famous article on Hawthorne's twice-told tales appeared in May 1842. Graham was always his own editor, although at times he had many distinguished associates. He had inherited Poe from Burton and would have kept him longer but for the quarrel with Charles J. Peterson, who was also an associate editor, as one informant tells us, or argument with Rufus W. Griswold, who took Poe's desk during a temporary absence. That was the cause, according to another version of the affair. At that time, between Graham and Poe, there seems to have been no unfriendly feeling, and the severance of the relation was very unfortunate for Poe and of no advantage at all to Graham. Well, some say it was the grind of monthly work that was too much for Poe, whose restlessness led to his resignation from Graham's in May 1842. Jealousy probably also played a role. Graham paid $4 a page for his critical articles, not much more for his tales. Longfellow received about $50 for each of his minor poems. The highest prices were those whom Graham had persuaded against their own desires, particularly Cooper and Hawthorne. A brief notice in the magazine read, "The connection of E.A. Poe-esque with this work ceased with the May publication. Mr. Poe bears with him our warmest wishes for success in whatever he may undertake." Now, at the time, the 32-year-old Poe and his 19-year-old wife of 6 years were again at the mercy of the world. After he paid all of his expenses, Poe reached New York City in 1844 with about $4.50 in his pockets. A biography of Edgar Allan Poe is beyond the scope of this podcast, since he's not buried at Laurel Hill. The fame of Graham's magazine was widespread throughout the country and known favorably to almost every American author of consequence. Within a year and a half of its appearance, Charles Dickens knew about it. Nathaniel Hawthorne, who had contributed one story to the magazine, chose to emphasize with mild sarcasm the popular aspects of both Graham's and Godey's when, in The House of Seven Gables, he had Holgrave assert that, quote, My name has figured on the cover of Graham and Godey. In the humorous line, I am thought to have a very pretty way with me. And as for pathos, I am as provocative of tears as an onion. The Grahams quickly became wealthy and respected citizens of Philadelphia. They moved to a large house on Mulberry Street in 1843. He drove behind a fine team of horses. The young man growing up down the street, named George W. Childs, admired what he saw, and he learned from Graham. Graham's house became a meeting place for authors, artists, lawyers, and businessmen. As early as 1842, Graham was wealthy enough to have his wife sit for a portrait by Thomas Sully, for which he paid $100. And by 1844, he had purchased a moderate-sized plot at the recently opened Laurel Hill Cemetery. The Grahams had no children, but they practically adopted a son of Mrs. Graham's sister, Mary. And for a time, a cousin, Catherine Rex, lived in the Graham home. And here the young girl met Poe, N.P. Willis, T.S. Arthur, Fanny Fern, Sarah Payson Willis, Mrs. Sarah Josepha Hale of Godey's, and Grace Greenwood, which was the pen name for Sarah Jane Clark. It was here that she heard Poe read The Gold Bug from manuscript, and here she helped her uncle to count the sums of money received in the day's mail from the subscribers. As Graham accumulated wealth, he cautiously started to invest. In October 1845, he joined Alexander Cummings, and he purchased the North American, an increasingly popular Philadelphia daily newspaper, which was to become one of the nation's leading Whig journals. Cummings had been born in Williamsport in 1810, later made his fortune through the Philadelphia Evening Bulletin, and then the New York World. Cummings, buried at Laurel Hill East in Section I, also served as governor of the territory of Colorado in 1865. Graham and Cummings chose noted lawyer and orator Robert Taylor Conrad, 1810 to 1858, as their editor. Conrad had written two well-known plays, including Conradin, and in the 1854 Philadelphia mayoral election would be nominee of both the Whigs and the Know-Nothings, and he won in a landslide. In literature, Conrad is best known for the tragedy Aylmer, which was purchased by Edwin Forrest. You'll hear more about Conrad, interred at Laurel Hill East in the South Section 14, in an upcoming episode of All Bones Considered concerning both the nativist riots of 1844 and Philadelphia playwrights. Cummings and Graham had political differences, and Cummings presently sold his portion to Graham, who became sole owner until 1 January 1847, when Morton McMichael, another Philadelphia lawyer and future mayor, also interred at Laurel Hill East, formed a partnership with him. I talked about McMichael at length in an earlier podcast. Later in 1847, the firm of Graham and McMichael persuaded Joseph R. Chandler, then in poor health, to sell his United States Gazette. And on 1 July, the two were merged, and the name changed to the North American and United States Gazette. To accomplish this merger of the two leading Philadelphia Whig newspapers, Graham and McMichael took on a third partner, another famed dramatist, Robert Montgomery Bird, 1806 to 1854. He's buried at Laurel Hill East in Section O. I will talk about Bird in the upcoming podcast on playwrights. So it was about 1848 that George Rex Graham took many of his earnings and got into stock speculation. And this led to a major crisis. Bird started to report that Graham was inattentive to his duties and frequently absent from the office. Graham used the credit of the firm to bolster his speculations. Bird and McMichael got together and they bought out Graham's interest, probably for the sum of his debts. Now, just as these troubles were brewing, the accounts of the magazine were suffering. To further his outside enterprises, Graham had borrowed on his magazine property, and by 1848 owned only about a third of the firm. His sister-in-law, Mrs. Mary Fry Rockefeller, owned 1/3. Robert T. Conrad and Samuel Deweese Patterson, Laurel Hill East Section C, owned another third. Graham had borrowed on his third, and that was his fatal mistake. The October 1848 issue of Graham's contained an admission of failure. But in 7 years, between 1841 and 1848, Graham's magazine had become the premier periodical in the United States. And when he lost control in 1848, the quality fell off. And soon his old magazine was reprinting articles from other magazines and using old inferior quality engravings as cost-cutting measures. Now, by 1850, Graham had recovered enough financially that he again became owner of his famous periodical. And he tried to win back his old readers and attract new ones. In fact, he printed 80,000 copies of an 1851 issue, and he gave away thousands of them as samples. But the beginning of the end came when critic Edwin Percy Whipple reviewed Harriet Beecher Stowe's anti-slavery tome, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and declared it a bad book. The title of his review says it all: Black Letters, or Uncle Tom's Foolery in Literature. In response to critics, Graham yielded nothing. He said that, quote, it was a badly constructed, badly timed, and made for a bad purpose. It was a mere distortion of facts, a stupendous lie. In short, a most despicable novel from the sale of which thousands of dollars were to be made by mercenary publishers. Now, don't get Graham wrong. He was not pro-slavery. He was pro-good writing. He'd been teaching freed blacks in Sunday school for years. In fact, he offered $1,000 to the president of Girard Bank, Charles S. Boker, father of the poet and playwright, to found a college for free Negroes if 300 abolitionists would subscribe the same amount. That's all he's asking for, $1,000 each from 300 abolitionists. Start up a college for freedmen. And it led nowhere. Nobody gave any money. The idea withered on the vine. Graham finally parted with his magazine in 1854, and the magazine quickly faded out of sight. By 1859, it was gone. It was now known as the American Monthly. Graham lived on for another 40 years. He was an almost forgotten man. As far as I can determine, he never wrote anything else. He never had another job, for that matter. And George W. Childs, the little kid who grew up down the street, who admired Graham, he was now the philanthropic owner of the Public Ledger, and he supported Graham for the rest of his life in public. This generosity was not even discovered until many years later. Graham even outlived his benefactor by a few years. He outlived his wife, Elizabeth, by nearly a quarter century. When he died on 13 July 1894 in Orange, New Jersey, there was no friend or family member at his bedside. He was buried in the plot he had purchased years earlier, Section I in the north section of Laurel Hill East. On 26 May 1894, just a few weeks before he died, Graham had written or dictated a letter to Laurel Hill Cemetery. Dear Sir, the deed of my lot in Laurel Hill Cemetery having been mislaid due to my long illness, I address you this letter of the purpose of identification and authorize my friend, Frank W. Baldwin, to order on my behalf anything to be done to said lot on my interment to be made therein. There are now 6 interments in the lots as follows. My wife, Elizabeth Graham, buried 1871. My wife's sister, Mary M. Rockefellow, buried 1877. My wife's brother, Levi Fry, died 1855. My sister's husband, Asa Rockefellow, died 1844. My wife's niece, Anna G. Rockefellow, died 1865. My wife's nephew, Harry Rockefellow, buried 1875. Note, Rockefellow, this Harry Rockefellow probably needs to be included in a podcast. He was severely injured at the Battle of Bull Run. This led to an imprisonment, an arm amputation. He escaped and stayed on active duty with one arm. Anyway, back to the letter. Kindly acknowledge the receipt of this communication and send to Mr. Baldwin or myself your acceptance and acquiescence to my request, and oblige yours truly. George Rex Graham lay in an unmarked grave for more than a century, until the Friends of Laurel Hill Cemetery purchased a simple granite stone in 2010 for his burial site. Okay, we got a lot of tours coming up in May and early June. Themed tours. First one, Saturday, May 4th, 1 o'clock. Don't miss it. Designing for the Dead, Art and Architecture. Tom Keels will take you on that tour. The next Saturday, on May 11th, is an accessible hotspots tour at Laurel Hill East, and I will be leading that one. We stay on the paved paths, no steps, no stairs, and we try to limit it to 90 minutes. So consider that if you've been wondering about hanging out for 2 hours on one of these tours. Also on the 11th, Stop the Presses, Printers and Publishers, and that's at 1 o'clock at Laurel Hill East. Peter Howell will be the guide for that one. This Sporting Life, Athletes at Laurel Hill West, is my tour. Saturday, May 18th, 1 p.m., Laurel Hill West, as I say. It's a long one. Be prepared to hike across open country on that one. Sunday, May 19th, 1 p.m., Laurel Hill East. Laurel Hill Goes to the Movies. Steve Chihuahua gives that tour. He's been doing that one for a long time. On Friday, May 24th at 10 a.m., Marty Foley is giving a Hotspots and Storied Plots tour at Laurel Hill East. Saturday, May 25th at 10 a.m., Pam McMahon is giving a Sacred Spaces and Storied Places tour at Laurel Hill West. And then Sunday, May 26th, Decoration Day, or Memorial Day if you prefer. We have our annual Reenactors Memorial Day with people in their Civil War attire. We have the gun salute. We have a brief prayer from the chaplain, and it's altogether a marvelous day at the cemetery, the place where Memorial Day was first celebrated 70-some years ago. There's also some stuff coming up in June. Out of the Closet into the Crypt, Laurel Hill East, will be Saturday, June 1st, 1 p.m. Pat Rose is doing that. And then the next day, Tom Stringer is doing one that I want to check out. It's called Hanging Up the White Coat, Doctors Who Went in a Different Direction. Sunday, June 2nd, Laurel Hill East at 10 a.m. That's a Sunday morning tour. Then Sunday afternoon tour on the 9th, June 9th, Stagecoaches and Omnibuses, Victorian Transportation at Laurel Hill East. So as you can see, oh, and don't forget, I'm going to tell you now, June 14th is the Victorian Spirit Crawl. A bunch of us, a dozen of us, are going to be leaving in shifts from the Gatehouse at Laurel Hill East for a twilight tour that finishes down by the river with some snacks. That's going to be a lot of fun. Again, that's June 14th. The Victorian Spirit Crawl at Laurel Hill East. Tickets for all of those available from laurelhillphl.com/events. Let us get back to the podcast. I mentioned Charles Peterson when I talked about George Graham. Peterson was at the center of a publishing dynasty that involves several family members over a few generations in the middle and at the end of the 19th century. Peterson's magazine is what people remember today. But the truth is there were many Peterson's magazines, including the Saturday Evening Post, the Lady's Friend, Graham's Magazine, Godey's Lady's Book. Others all had a Peterson in charge at one time or another. Now, the magazine named Peterson's is now considered to have been only a step or two behind Graham's and on par with Godey's. There are dozens of the Peterson family in both Laurel Hill East with 10 plots and Laurel Hill West with 2 plots. It took me hours to sort through all of these folks until I could figure out who was who. Many of them were in the publishing business, and I'm going to talk about 5 of them today. Charles Jacobs Peterson and his son Thomas Howard Peterson, Robert Evans Peterson, his brother Henry Peterson, and Henry's son Arthur Peterson. Those are the 5 that I intend to talk about. Now, Charles Jacobs Peterson was born in Philadelphia 20 July 1819. He was the son of Thomas P. Peterson and his wife Elizabeth Snelling Jacobs Peterson. He was a descendant of Eric Peterson, who was a 1638 emigre from Sweden, the first known Petersons on the continent. Charles studied law at the University of Pennsylvania with the class of 1838, and he was admitted to the bar, but he never practiced his profession. In May 1839, not quite 20 years old, Charles went to work for George Rex Graham, who just purchased the local magazine Atkinson's Casket. Peterson retained his role as associate editor when this magazine became Graham's magazine in 1841. This is when he was sharing the editorial desk with Edgar Allan Poe. Now, Peterson and Graham remained lifelong friends. Also, in 1840, Charles purchased a part interest in the Saturday Evening Post, in which Graham also held a part interest. And in the same year, he founded the Ladies' World, which was afterwards called the Ladies' National Magazine. Its editor was Sarah H. Peterson, his wife, 1825-1896. It was in 1848 that Charles Peterson started Peterson's Magazine and then stayed editor until his death nearly 50 years later. His audience was women. The magazine was run by men. There were, however, frequent contributions by female authors. Emily H. May, Anne S. Stevens, again, who created the dime novel genre. Much like Graham's, Peterson's magazine combined fashion plates with short fiction stories and novels, as well as patterns for embroidery and crochet and musical compositions. The magazine was popular also due to its steel plate engravings, which were of a high quality but still inexpensive to purchase. By the 1870s, Peterson's had a circulation of 150,000. Peterson's magazine was aiming for the same audience as Godey's Lady's Book, but it only cost $2 a year as opposed to $3 a year for Godey's. Charles Peterson appears to be one of those people who couldn't not write. In the 1840s, he was an editorial writer for Joseph Clay Neal's Saturday Gazette and for the Philadelphia Bulletin from its beginning in 1847. He wrote many sketches and poems for various newspapers and periodicals, and he published several historical works. In 1848, his Military Heroes of the Revolution with a Motivation of the War of Independence appeared. Later, similar books on the War of 1812 and the War of Mexico were also issued. A number of historical novels are credited to him. Among them, Grace Dudley, or Arnold at Saratoga, and Kate Aylesford, A Story of the Refugees. Charles sometimes used a pseudonym when he wrote. Harry Cavendish published several stories, and there was one by Henry R. Shipley. I found another one by Harry Danforth. All of these were Charles Peterson. In 1852, he published the novel The Cabinet or Parlor, or Slaves and Masters. This was under the pseudonym J. Thornton Randolph. This was one of the early examples of the anti-Tom literature, which arose in response to Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was published by T.B. Peterson Limited, a company founded and run by his younger brothers, Theophilus, George, and Thomas, in 1858. Charles Peterson died in Philadelphia 4 March 1887, 68 years old, and he was interred at Laurel Hill East in Section G, just a few feet from General Hugh Mercer. Businessman philanthropist Joseph Horton was buried a few feet away in 1911. Media mogul Frank Munsey purchased the magazine in 1898, and he combined it with another magazine, Argosy, which went out of business in the 1970s. Now, as Charles' publications were flourishing, he took on his second oldest son, Thomas Howard Peterson, to learn the ropes. He was born in 1847. He went by T. Howard, or simply Howard. It was understood that he would one day take over as editor and publisher of Peterson's magazine. He married 23-year-old Mary Cannell in 1871. She was the daughter of Simon Wilmer Cannell and Sarah Nivison Humbertson Skipworth Cannell. She had a son named Howard in the spring of 1872, but he died less than 5 months later and was buried in the family plot. 2 living children followed, and the family settled into a mansion at 1525 Walnut Street. After Mary suffered a miscarriage in December 1880, she was sent under doctor's orders to Atlantic City, New Jersey, for the refreshing, healing sea air and the rest cure. At the end of his work week, the 34-year-old Howard came to visit her on Saturday, 5 February, 1881. The next morning, he went out for a long drive after breakfast before a Sunday afternoon dinner. And afterwards, he decided to delay his return to Philadelphia until Monday morning. At about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he went on a long walk. It was something he was in the habit of doing. His wife never saw him again. When he failed to return after his walk, Mary notified the authorities. Howard was described as 5 feet 9 inches, light of complexion, with a light brown beard, whiskers, and mustache, and slightly stoop-shouldered. When last seen, he wore a heavy blue overcoat, brown coat, vest, and pantaloons, purple necktie with a mosaic pin showing a white lamb on a red background. On his middle finger was a bloodstone ring with a crest and a double-case silver watch. There was initially fear that he was a victim of foul play. But an initial investigation in New Jersey seemed to show that he'd changed his mind again and gone back to Philadelphia. Both the station master and the conductor, who knew Howard well, swore that he'd been on a train back to the city on Monday morning. But a thorough search of Atlantic City, Philadelphia, and lands in between failed to turn him up. The theory was put forward that he had walked out to the pier and lost his footing on the ice-covered timbers. His father Charles and Uncle Theophilus accepted this story. Mary came back to Philadelphia, still baffled by her loved one's disappearance. On 18 June of 1881, more than 5 months after Howard's disappearance, 2 young boys were fishing at Tatham's Beach, sometimes called 7 Mile Island. It's a barrier island near Cape May. That's where Avalon and Stone Harbor are located. One of the boys, John Jenkins, saw a dark object, which he remarked to his companion looked like a man's body. And when it came close enough to secure, the boys notified beach authorities. The body was badly decomposed, but fully dressed, complete with a ruby ring and a silver pocket watch. There was a letter in the jacket pocket addressed to 1525 Walnut Street. There was $18 in his pocket, and there was no doubt that this was the missing body of T. Howard Peterson. 4 days later, Peterson was buried in the family plot at Laurel Hill East, where a marble grave marker was placed. Whether his tumble to the sea was the result of foul play, accident, or suicide was never determined. Howard's father was devastated by the loss of his only son, and his health went downhill until his death 6 years later. Howard's widow, Mary, moved to New York to live with her parents and never remarried. She outlived Howard by more than 30 years and died at age 64 of lobar pneumonia and myocardial degeneration. Mary made a decision before she died. Most of her mortal remains would stay with her parents at All Saints Episcopal Church in Torresdale, the church where she had married Howard. But her heart was to be surgically removed and interred at her husband's family's burial plot. That means that Mary Cannell Peterson is literally 2 places at once. She has a separate burial certificate for each cemetery and separate listings for heart and body on the universal reference, Find a Grave. And Mary's heart made it back where she wanted it. There's a letter in the lot file for Section G, Lot 160, to the funeral home. I don't know what that letter from the funeral home to the superintendent said, but here is his reply. Dated 11 December 1912. Mary had died on 5 December 1912, 1 week before this. R.R. Bringhurst and Company, 38 North 11th Street, Philadelphia. Gentlemen, referring to the mistake in opening grave for the Peterson interment, I would say that I have investigated the affair and find that the mistake was made by our foreman under mitigating circumstances. The first of which is that our letters for the interment of Howard C. Peterson were in error, and again the foreman, whose eyesight is not as good as it once was, failed to notice the partly obliterated letter T on the headstone over the grave of T. Howard Peterson, thus opening his grave. We would not have made such an error intentionally, and I believe you can substantiate when I say that we are as careful as it is possible for any cemetery to be in locating graves. So, if I read this right, Mary's heart was supposed to go into the tomb of her first son, Howard C., who died at 5 months old in 1872. And because of a nearsighted gravedigger, it was placed with her husband. But you have to admit, even if the cemetery made a mistake, the sincerity of the letter shows that their heart was in the right place. Charles Jacob Peterson, second son of Thomas Peterson, 1791 to 1854. Thomas's older brother, George Henry Peterson, was 6 years older, and he had a small publishing dynasty of his own, plus 5 sons and 5 daughters. Now, Charles' first son, Robert Evans Peterson, 1812 to 1894, studied law under his father-in-law, John Bouvier. Although he was admitted to the bar, he never practiced law. He worked for a while in the hardware business. Robert married his mentor's daughter, Hannah Mary Bouvier, 1811 to 1870. She was the only child of John Bouvier. Bouvier, 1787 to 1851, Laurel Hill East, Section F. He was a French Quaker who'd immigrated to the United States in 1802 with his parents. And if you trace the family line, you will find connections to famed cabinet maker Michel Bouvier, interred at Old St. Mary's Roman Catholic Churchyard at 248 South 4th Street. Emma Mary Bouvier Drexel, wife of financier Anthony Drexel, stepmother to St. Catherine Drexel. Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy Onassis, First Lady of the United States from 1961 to 63. Robert decided to study medicine at the University of Pennsylvania, and he earned his MD in 1863 when he was 51 years old, but he never practiced medicine. He also taught Hannah advanced mathematics and supported her interest in the sciences and encouraged her to write and publish. In 1850, Robert Peterson entered the book publishing business in partnership with a familiar name, George W. Childs. In 1854, the firm R.E. Peterson and Company moved from 5th and Arch Street to 602 Arch Street and changed its name to Childs and Peterson. And they struck it rich in 1856 when they published Dr. Elisha Kent Kane's blockbuster memoirs, Arctic Explorations, a huge financial success. I talked about Hannah a little bit in All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 52, Reach for the Sky, Astronomers of Laurel Hill. Hannah wrote her first book in 1850. It was called Familiar Science, but it was published under her husband's name. It sold more than 250,000 copies, and her name wasn't on it. During her lifetime, Hannah Bouvier usually published anonymously or under her maiden name. A preface to an edition of the National Cookbook, written by her husband after her death, indicates that, quote, when this work was prepared for the press, she declined to let her name appear as the author, from her great dislike to notoriety, observing that a woman should never be known outside of her own home. In 1857, using her maiden name, she wrote and published the book for which she is best remembered, Bouvier's Familiar Astronomy, or An Introduction to the Study of the Heavens. 500 pages long, more than 200 detailed drawings of everything from constellations in the skies to various complicated pieces of equipment. Hannah and Robert's daughter Emma married George W. Childs, co-owner of the Philadelphia newspaper The Public Ledger with Anthony Joseph Drexel. Emma and George were childless. They're interred together in the Childs Mausoleum along Millionaires Row in Laurel Hill East. Hannah Mary Bouvier Peterson died 4 September 1870 in Long Branch, New Jersey, at the home of her daughter and son-in-law. After Hannah died, Robert Peterson soon married Blanche Gottschalk, sister of pianist and composer Louis Moreau Gottschalk, and after Blanche died in 1874, he married Clara Gottschalk, another sister of the composer. Robert Peterson died in 1894. Hannah Bouvier Peterson and Robert Evans Peterson are buried at Laurel Hill East in Section F. They are just a few feet away from the Academy of Music architect Napoleon Lebrun and from the Bolan family plot, the final resting place of 20th century diplomat Chip Bolan, his wife Avis, and their family. Hannah's marble headstone reads simply, in the fashion of Quakers, Hannah M., wife of Robert E. Peterson. No last name, no maiden name, no mention that she was the author of the best-selling astronomy textbook in the 19th century. Robert Peterson's younger brother by 6 years was Henry Peterson, 1818 to 1891. who was also an accomplished editor, novelist, poet, and playwright, who served as editor of the Saturday Evening Post for 30 years. Born in Philadelphia, he joined the firm of Deacon and Peterson in 1839. Robert's sister, Rachel Evans Peterson, 1840 to 1862, had married Edmund Deacon, 1810 to 1877. Robert's even younger sister, Helen Longstreth Peterson, had married Charles T. Deacon in 1854. Charles went on to commit suicide by hanging in 1882 when he was about to be arrested on suspicion of fraud. Deacon chose a deserted spot down by Hog Island where his body was not found for several days. The newspapers were very happy to report that a farmer found his partially decomposed remains hanging by a rope in his barn, quote, the rats having almost devoured the feet, end quote. Henry Peterson, as an editor, refused to publish the works of female writer E.D.E.N. Southworth on the grounds that her work was immoral. The Saturday Evening Post became very successful, so Henry bought out Deacon and changed the company's name to H. Peterson and Company. The company also published The Lady's Friend, which was edited by his wife. In 1838, he addressed the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society and said, "Even an army of occupation here could not put the Negro into the streetcars," end quote. Henry Peterson died on 10 October 1891. He's buried at Laurel Hill East in Section F, along with several other family members. His youngest sister, Felina Marshall Peterson, married William E. Newhall, 1834 to 1906. Newhall was a very successful banker who, when he was 71 years old, was walking in front of the land title building on Chestnut Street above Broad when he fell into a 20-foot deep hole at a construction site, fractured both of his legs, broke his pelvis, broke his back, died shortly after. The last Peterson, Henry's second oldest son, Arthur Peterson, 1851-1932. He was assistant editor at the Saturday Evening Post by the time he was 20 years old. But when the magazine exchanged hands, he joined the Navy. He spent the next 25 years traveling the world and on stateside duty, and late in his career, he was actually with Admiral Dewey at Manila Bay. After his retirement from the Navy, Arthur wrote and published several volumes of poetry, including Sigurd and Andvari's Ring, the same story from Norse mythology that inspired Tolkien's Lord of the Rings trilogy. When he died in 1931, Arthur generously bequeathed $50,000 to the Charlotte Cushman Society and $20,000 to the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, and he left 3 Packard automobiles to his chauffeur. Arthur is buried in a mausoleum in the Belmont section of Laurel Hill West. Now that's just across the street from the Hera Gothic Mausoleum on its island. Arthur had married Georgiana Hera in 1891. If you are a member of the Friends of Laurel Hill, there's a possibility you've been inside Alfred's mausoleum. It's the one with the large stained glass window that shows the Bay of Rio de Janeiro. Georgiana's father, Charles Jefferson Hera, had made his fortune building railroads in Brazil. As you can see, there are dozens of Petersons I could talk about. I'm going to stop here. Just remember that when somebody mentions Peterson's magazine, you know there were a handful of periodicals that could have gone by that name. When I think about 19th century magazines based in Philadelphia, they're usually the ones that I've been telling you about: Godey's, Graham's, Peterson's, The Post. But Lippincott's magazine was a successful monthly for 47 years. From 1868 to 1915, it far outlasted Graham's. Through its long, illustrious life, Lippincott magazine attracted such writers as Willa Cather, Arthur Conan Doyle, Paul Laurence Dunbar, Oscar Wilde, and Rudyard Kipling. While Peterson's and its affiliates were run by the same family for 3 generations, Lippincott's Publishing Company was led by the same family for at least 5 generations. It still exists as the L in LWW. The LWW branch of Walters Kluwer Publishers is Lippincott, Williams, and Wilkins. And as far as Laurel Hill goes, I count 153 people named Lippincott at the 2 sister cemeteries. Now, unlike Godey's and Graham's, which depended on colored prints and engravings to sell issues, Lippincott's monthly magazine, which started in 1868 as Lippincott's Magazine of Literature, Science, and Education, eventually removed all illustrations from its pages. The name changed in 1885 to Lippincott's Monthly Magazine. The covers were usually colorful illustrations of young people reading copies of this magazine in various locations. With the quantity and quality of scientific publications, Lippincott's found itself more in competition with the Boston-based magazine, The Atlantic. The Lippincott Publishing concern traces its roots to the country's beginnings. While Philadelphia was the nation's capital in 1792, there were a bevy of businesses on High Street, which is now Market Street, down by the docks on the Delaware. The streets, of course, were paved with cobblestones. There was a town crier who still called out the news. Benjamin Franklin had established his nephew as a printer, and he was turning out what Franklin called pretty little children's books. But there was already competition in this comparatively new field of printing and publishing. The little printing shop and bookstore of Jacob Johnson. His business continued under a succession of name and ownership changes until in 1849 it was known as Grigg, Elliott and Company, and it was big. Now, Joshua Ballinger Lippincott, as a boy, had worked in a bookstore. At the age of 23, he'd taken the risk of starting retail bookselling and publishing on his own account. Between 1836 and 1849, his business had risen to a point which enabled him to buy and merge with his own company, the House of Grigg, Elliott and Company. J.B. Lippincott was born in the vicinity of Mount Holly, New Jersey, on 18 March 1813. That's just 2 months after George Rex Graham. Joshua came to Philadelphia at the age of 11. When he was 14, he started working in a bookstore for a man named Clark. When that firm failed, he was placed in charge by the creditors, and he slowly built it back up again. And within a few years, he had his own shop at the southwest corner of 4th and Race Streets under the firm name of J.B. Lippincott and Company. J.B. was 32 years old when he married Josephine Craig, 1823 to 1899, who was 10 years his junior. They married in 1845, and their son Craig was born the next year, followed by Walter in 1849, Josephine in 1850, John L. in 1852, and Joshua Bertram in 1857. In 1849, J.B. purchased Grigg, Elliott and Company, which by then was the largest and the most prosperous printing firm in Philadelphia. He continued in this tradition of educational materials with Lippincott's Pronouncing Gazetteer of the World and Lippincott's Pronouncing Dictionary of Biography and Mythology. Another early publication was Samuel Gross's Chirurgical Review. In 1850, he began the partnership of Lippincott, Grambo and Company, which lasted only until 1855, when the business resumed its original title. Later, he made an alliance with the English publishers Robert and William Chambers, and a Liverpool branch of J.V. Lippincott and Company opened in 1876. As the firm expanded, so did Lippincott's workspace, and its stock grew. By 1861, there was a large 6-story building at 6th and Commerce, which had to be expanded again in 1872. Inventory swelled with histories and biographies like Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Charles Francis Adams' Life of John Adams, Henry S. Randall's Jefferson, and Stonewall Jackson. Medical texts, well, how about tomes by D. Hayes Agnew, Jacob DaCosta, and Joseph Leidy. Law books, they published Blackstone's Commentaries and Bouvier's Law Dictionary, which I hinted at briefly when I talked about the Peterson family. Plus, the complete works of standard authors such as Addison, Irving, Goethe, Lamb, Sheridan, Swift, and others. And soon, Lippincott was importing works by Scott, Dickens, Thackeray, and other well-known contemporary authors. In 1878, J.B. Lippincott Company published the first textbook of nursing in the United States, and they published the first issue of American Journal of Nursing in 1900. One of Lippincott's crowning achievements was the imposing The New Variorum edition of Shakespeare. It was published between 1871 and 1913 and edited by the great Shakespearean scholar and Laurel Hill East resident Horace Howard Furness and his son, Horace Jr. There is currently a massive online project called newvariorumshakespeare.org. It is in the thick of posting its entire works to date online as an open access project. It is still in beta testing. If you are old-fashioned and you still want the 24-volume set of the Variorum published in 1900, it's available online for $1,200. It was in 1868 that Lippincott magazine had started in competition with other literary magazines of the day. Like Graham's, Lippincott published original works, general articles, and literary criticism. Each edition contained a complete novel or novelette by some strong writer, followed by short stories and articles, and capped by several pages of very popular and very much quoted wit and humor. Its advertising read, "Fresh, clever, original, clean." Early novels published in the magazine include Kipling's first version of The Light That Failed, Emily Reeves' much-discussed The Quick or the Dead, James Lane Allen's The Choir Invisible, C.G.D. Roberts' The Heart of Ancient Wood, Arthur Conan Doyle's The Sign of the Four, and Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. Other contributors included Jack London, A.C. Swinburne, Bret Harte, Maurice Hewlett, Owen Wister, Sir Gilbert Parker, Mary Roberts Rinehart, S. Ware Mitchell, and many others. And they published dozens of poems by Emma Lazarus, although not The New Colossus, which is probably her best known, well, definitely is her best known poem. In 1886, Joshua B. Lippincott died of Syrian fever, which he contracted while traveling in the Holy Land. He was 72 years old. His business practices and integrity had made him an important and noteworthy Philadelphia merchant, a tradition he wanted his sons to continue. Walter, the second son of J.B. and Josephine Craig Lippincott, seemed the most likely to fulfill his father's legacy based on his, quote, soundness of judgment and general abilities, end quote. At the time of his marriage to Elizabeth Horstman in 1879, when he was 30, Walter was already heavily involved in the administration of his father's business. He had received his early education at the Thomas Baldwin School in Philadelphia, no relationship to the Baldwin School for Girls. He entered the University of Pennsylvania in 1864, but at the close of his sophomore year, he abandoned his college courses because of his father's requests, and he entered the publishing business. After 14 years of active and unremitting work, he suffered a nervous breakdown that forced him into early retirement. Following a period of rest, he was able to assume an advisory position in the firm, and in 1885 rose back to become a board member. However, the responsibility and the general operations of the business were assumed by his brothers, Craig and Joshua Bertram. During his recovery, Walter turned most of his energies to his new wife, Elizabeth, and his baby Bertha, born in 1880. The couple owned several properties. They had ample funds for travel and leisure. Elizabeth spent much time decorating their homes and entertaining, while Walter turned his attention to writing political editorials, participating in the arts, and yachting. Another of his passions was philanthropy. He contributed to such organizations as the Philadelphia Lying in Charity, and in 1917 he gifted property at 9th and Clinton Streets for the creation of a United Service Club, a social and lodging facility for off-duty officers in the Philadelphia area. In other words, a USO. The club was disbanded shortly after the Great War, only to be reopened through the efforts of his only child, Bertha. When Walter stepped down as president, Craig Lippincott, the oldest brother by 3 years, was next to phase into the leadership role. Craig had been given his mother's maiden name as his first name, as was the custom of the day. He was educated privately before he continued his studies at the University of Pennsylvania and then in Europe. When he returned to the United States in 1866, he was 20 years old and he entered his father's business. In 1871, he married 23-year-old Sally Erie Bucknell, 1848 to 1919. They had 3 children together, J. Bucknell Lippincott, Josephine Lippincott Reeves, and Constance Lippincott Morey. Craig was, to no one's surprise, a member of the Union League, the Bachelor's Barge Club, and many other charitable organizations. A catastrophic fire in 1899 destroyed the offices and the manufacturing plant of the company on Market Street. This led to the current location of their headquarters at 6th and Locust, facing Washington Square. And Lippincott stayed with the company. In the early 20th century, a prospective author told of visits to various publishing houses. In New York, I asked for Mr. Appleton, Mr. Harper, Mr. Putnam, but found no one of these old names in publishing. In Philadelphia, I asked for Mr. Lippincott and was met with the astonishing question, which Mr. Lippincott do you want to see? At the time, there were 4 of them in charge. The youngest and 3rd Lippincott brother was Joshua Bertram Lippincott. He was born in 1857 when his father was 44 and his mother was 34. Joshua married Joanna Jenny Horton, 1858-1938, the 3rd daughter of philanthropist and businessman Joseph Horton. They were married in 1885. As with the rest of her family, Joanna was a Hicksite Quaker and an active member of the board of Swarthmore College from 1894 to 1933. She was vital in the formation of the observatory for the college, where her relative, Sarah Lee Lippincott, astronomer and wife of television personality Dave Garroway, practiced during her long distinguished career. Joshua Ballinger also ascended to the role of editor, meaning all 3 sons of the magazine's founder served in that role at one time. In 1915, Lippincott's magazine relocated to New York City. It became McBride's Magazine. It merged with Scribner's Magazine in 1916. There had been 96 semi-annual volumes, most of which are available online through archive.org or other organizations. Many of the originals are highly sought, especially those which contain the early works of Conan Doyle and Wilde. The Lippincotts are mostly buried together under a modest obelisk in the south section of Laurel Hill East Cemetery. Their underground crypt has 20 slots, 7 of which are in use, and it looks like nobody's been buried in the plot in nearly 90 years. Not to worry, though. I think the name Lippincott will live for a long, long time in the history of Philadelphia. In the mid-May edition of Biographical Bites from Bala, Laurel Hill West Stories, I'm going to tell you about Dennis Sandoll, a Philadelphia guitarist and instructor who taught such major figures as John Coltrane, Art Farmer, Pat Martino, and many others. And then the June 2024 episode of All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories, is about 19th century Philadelphia playwrights. As usual, I thought it was going to be about 3. Now I've got 5 names. It may be a 2-part show. But the 5 names I have: Robert Montgomery Bird, George Henry Boker, Robert Conrad, Richard Penn Smith, and Lucy Hamilton Hooper. All of them 19th century Philadelphia playwrights. All of them buried at Laurel Hill East. Laurel Hill East is located at 3822 Ridge Avenue in the East Falls section of Philadelphia. It's an easy walk from the bus stop at Ridge and Allegheny for SEPTA buses R1 and 81. Admission is free, as is parking in the lot across the street, although spaces are very limited. There is an app you can download for a self-guided tour through Laurel Hill East 78 acres. Laurel Hill West is at 225 Belmont Avenue in Bala Cynwyd. There's parking both at the main entrance and at the bell tower. Your best bet for public transportation: take the SEPTA Regional Rail to Manayunk or one of the many buses to the Wissahickon Transfer Center on Ridge Avenue. Cross the Schuylkill River on the Pencoid pedestrian bridge. Come up Writers Ferry Road to the entrance near the Pet Cemetery. You can also download audios I have done for self-guided tours at Laurel Hill West. They will lead you to a 40 to 45-minute audio tour that talks about people interred along the bicycle route through the cemetery. Both Laurel Hill East and Laurel Hill West are currently open from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., and we welcome pretty much anyone: dog walkers, bike riders, photographers, painters, bird watchers, nature buffs, tree and plant lovers, skateboarders, and strollers, both the 2-footed and 4-wheeled variety. If you follow us on Facebook and Instagram, you'll get a daily reminder of some of our inhabitants and activities. You can also follow All Bones Considered on Instagram and Facebook and TikTok. And once you've fallen in love with these hotspots, become a friend of Laurel Hill. You'll have the opportunity for several members-only special tours conducted each year, including some inside the mausoleum visits. They may be cemeteries, but they are a couple of the liveliest spots in town. The key to finding the gift shop online: click on Support. Find the gift shop in the left-hand column. Our theme song, Names at Peace, written and performed by local artist James Harrow. All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories, and biographical bites from Bala, Laurel Hill West Stories, are researched, written, narrated, and produced by me, Joe Lex, retired professor of emergency medicine at Temple University, whom you can reach through my email, jrlexjr1947@gmail.com. And remember to keep body and soul together until the next time we meet on All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories, where I try to help the plot thicken. Stick around. Here are the references that I use for this podcast. And maybe I will see you at the cemetery with that tours I've got coming up at both East and West in May. Stick around if you want to hear the bibliography. Okay, here is bibliography for Graham's Magazine. A Brief History of Graham's Magazine by Frank Luther Mott. It was in Studies in Philology, July 1928, volume 25, number 3, pages 362 to 374. Then there's a chapter by J. Albert Robbins with 2 B's called George R. Graham, Philadelphia Publisher. And I'm not seeing what this was in. George R. Graham Publisher, J. Albert Robbins. And for some reason, it's not telling me what the source on this was. Apologies. It's 1951. I can tell you that much. It was printed in 1951. But as I scroll through it, normally at the top or at the bottom, it tells you what the journal is. And I copied this out of a journal, and I didn't bother to put down what the journal was. All right. What about Peterson's magazine? A lot of the information on Peterson's I also got from Frank Mott's History of Magazine Publishing, and quite a bit from newspapers also. The Peterson family tree is so extensive, I ended up with a 3 full pages of family members buried at the 12 sites at Laurel Hill East and the 2 sites at Laurel Hill West. They're just scattered all over the place. For Joshua Lippincott, there's a really nice article called The Lippincotts of Philadelphia. No author is identified. The source is ALA Bulletin, June 1957, volume 51, number 6, pages 428 to 423. And then 2 general articles. One is called Philadelphia Magazines for Ladies, 1830 to 1860. It was by Bertha Monica Stearns, the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography, July 1945, volume 69, number 3, pages 207 to 219. And then a Compendium of American Literature, chronologically arranged, biographical sketches of the authors and selections from their work on the plan of the author's Compendium of English Literature and English Literature of the 19th Century by Charles D. Cleveland. And that was published Philadelphia, 1859, E.C.J. Biddle, number 508 Minor Street. Minor Street, it's even nice enough to tell you, Minor Street is between Market and Chestnut and 5th and 6th. I don't think it's there anymore. It's very close to the radio station where I do a live show, and I don't remember seeing Minor Street. That was it. Thank you for listening to the podcast. I'll try to get information about the editor of Philadelphia Magazine in a future podcast. I just didn't have time to research him. I got hung up on the Petersons, to be honest with you, and that took the better part of a day. Stay safe, stay well. See you around the cemetery.